I want to talk about fractals in media and the nature of reality as a holographic and fractal pattern, which suggests a doorway through which to look at media. Now, when you have a fractal pattern, and when you have a dynamic evolving consciousness in relationship with patterns, what tends to come to consciousness are the patterns that are getting to an extreme point in our need of medicine. So we can think of medicine as that which heals, which is that which makes whole, which is that which restores the balance of the set. And so to the degree that something becomes an extreme, it becomes dissonant in the larger context of wholeness, which is simply an asymmetrical imbalance that's emerging in a particular set. So within a human body, there's a certain amount of salt that if you don't have it, you die, and if you do have too much, you die, and there's a point in between. And what happens is pain is the messenger of asymmetry. And the paradigms, the memes, the fractal patterns that tend to present themselves to consciousness as a self-medicating, self-evolving entity or enterprise is those things which are getting out of balance and need attention. And it's a particularly important evolutionary point where the paradigm that leads to the imbalance in the first place and is creating greater intensities of imbalance and pain cannot lead to an awareness that would restore balance. So one actually has to create a new paradigm in order to recognize the dimension in which the imbalance is occurring and then measure the imbalance and then use that new paradigm as a map to come back to wholeness, back to symmetry, back to grace. So what's the use of media in this context? Well, some cultures were sophisticated enough to have lucid dreaming, to not medicate themselves to sleep in such atrocious ways that they lack all coherence in dream state, and they simply go to sleep, and in so many ways the dream state medicates the day. So if they're too much out of alignment in this direction, they might have a dream of the counterpart, the counter reality, and in doing so restore the consciousness to wholeness. But also provide leadership, provide reminders, provide impulses to the future. Well, as part of our particular age's mass materialism and with that externalization, dreams are heavily taboo and discounted at every level. First, we provide all kinds of substances and drugs that dull consciousness, and then we make all of the drugs that elucidate consciousness Schedule 1 and absolute taboo and put people away in boxes for expanding consciousness. Secondly, we overstimulate and over-mediate in the sense of overstimulating with media during the day and with this and that and the other that we can barely capture the ephemeral sensitivity of the dreamscape at night. Thirdly, we say it's just imagination and the mindless nonsense. And so we have covered and buried the subconscious and unconscious mind in every way possible. Then to that we add mythological illiteracy, psychological illiteracy, atheism, and shame anyone who believes and imagines in their naivete that there could be something bigger than ourselves, the ultimate egotism. And in doing so, we're left looking out for messages from the unconscious in the only little box left within our cult, which is that which is externalized in the world around us. Well, it's very difficult for the world around us in its asymmetrical or diseased state to provide the message of its own medicine. Because if it had the message of its own medicine, we wouldn't need to heal it. It would already be symmetrical. It would already be healthy. It would be whole. There would be a sense of grace. So where do we turn? And this leads to a paradigm for exploring the new dreams. Because dreams have been one expression, art has been another expression, poetry, painting, dance, movement, sound, ritual. These have all been doorways into the imagination. And the imagination is innately healthy. The psyche is, by its very nature, seeking wholeness, by exploring, by presenting, by creating, by penetrating the limited myopic sphere of the egoic telescope, the zoom-in lens of the conscious mind, with its stubborn determination to follow a given straight line until its ultimate point. Because if you follow a straight line, in the largest sense of the world, it comes around as a circle. There are no straight lines. You head one way far enough and you ultimately come round to the other side. You decide you want to be completely selfish. And so you say, okay, I believe in selfishness. No, that no one else matters, etc. So I want a healthy body for me because I'm selfish. And then I want money for me because I want to spend whatever I want. And then I want a beautiful house for me. And then I want a beautiful landscape for me. And then, hell, it's not enough just to have my own landscape look nice. I want my whole, everywhere I drive, everywhere I look on the news, I want to see the top line, most beautiful thing imaginable. If I go to this airport, I want high-speed Wi-Fi. If I go to this airport, I want, high-speed Wi-Fi. I want everything for me to be perfect for me. And I don't want to see unhappy people, out there. They should smile because I'm there and stuff. And so, ultimately, true selfishness leads to a revolution of the planet where one actively invests in the well-being and the excellence and the beauty, truth, and goodness of every iota on the planet, because I might want to visit there. And I don't want to, have those people having a war on my news, etc. I would enjoy, them being like this ultimately, because, after the powerlessness, which isn't really a lot of fun, after the powerlessness of revenge, meaning, it's like so-and-so hurt my feelings before, and so I'm going to have revenge because how dare they, I can't deal with those feelings. Certainly out of the powerlessness, but true selfishness leads to mastery. True selfishness, you develop oneself to a point where one grows out of that powerlessness, because I don't want to feel powerless, so I develop mastery. Well, then that heals the revenge cycle, because it's too much work and it's no fun punishing people when you're in a great state. It ruins the mood if you're truly empowered and understand your own possibility. It's satisfying to see other people realizing their possibility. So what do you get at the end of total selflessness? Or you get selfishness. And what do you get at the end of total selfishness? You get selflessness. Because what better gift could you give to everyone else than to be at your best, to be secure, resourceful, develop all your potential, and participate in the becoming and evolution of the planet. And so, in this sense, you go on a straight line, you end up, coming at the place you began at a slightly different direction. Things are spherical and spiral in nature. And so, having decided on materialism and this and that and the other, nothing is real, just in thoughts. And so we have created an explosion of externalized media. There has never, to our knowledge in the history of the planet, been so many billions of dollars and so many human man-hours and computer hours spent in the production of synthetic reality in all forms of media. And it's just ramping up in an exponential curve, which with virtual reality, it is very probable that more energy will be spent in the next 40 years transforming and revolutionizing virtual reality that is being spent outdoors and out of the house on the planet itself, as people walk around, in trash-strewn streets among homeless people wearing goggles of their perfect world. And as the visor interplay between reality outside, and the game inside, etc., blends, we're going to see billions, if not trillions of dollars being spent in the creation and evolution of virtual reality to replace and come back to the point of the ancients of simply having the lucidity to have mastery of one's own imagination, and the fact that our imagination in vivid emotional terms is already synaptically connected with a droid, with an archetype, with a structure, with a vehicle, with perfect, gradiated, multi-sensory perception. We've got it here. We're discounting the inner world, and so we're spending trillions to create in denser physical sensation that which we can already do but neglect as a culture. We neglect the imagination. We neglect intention. We neglect attitude. We neglect the conscious framing of beliefs. We neglect thinking and feeling. And so the only thing to do in an apathy of self-negation is to replicate that which we neglect on the inside, the feminine, the inner world, the ephemeral, and spend 10 times the energy to recreate in a cruder form that very reality on the outside. So that's what we're up to as a culture. We're creating externalized media. Now, what's this really mean? It means that the unconscious is being externalized into media. Now, there's two forms of media. One is the media that we call news and pretend is real, and the other is the media that we call fiction, and we don't pay it any heed. Now, that which is called real is subjugated to an intense barrage of political correctness, meaning the spiritual critic, the cultural critic, the global critic, the biological critic. Every critic imaginable is in political tension to decide which studies to do and which studies to never do as part of the biggest bias imaginable. For example, the amount of study of human emotions in the last 100 years relative to the atom, one atom. The study of the atom, the study of emotion, the amount of research and development put into an atom versus the entire field of human emotions is more than 1,000 to 1. More than 1,000 times the research dollars have gone into consciously developing the science of relating to an atom, then relating to the entire panoply of emotional software that motivates every single conscious action the species has ever performed. So the biggest political tension is in what to study and focus on and what to pathologically ignore and minimize at all costs, to the point that women within the new feminism, having been denigrated for being too emotional, are actively competing to redefine the feminist woman as being less emotional. So not only not do the emotion, the research and development on the biology of emotion, on the psychology of emotion, on the mythology of emotion, on every science of emotion imaginable, and to understand the synaptic connections between a thought, a belief, a sensation, and a feeling. We know absolutely nothing compared to what there is to know in that domain, because in the area of political debate, the big power struggle is the dominant paradigm that will bully the investment of resources into this little box that self-referentially supports an asymmetrical cult called culture in becoming more and more extreme. And so in that sense, just like a pipe, when you have 200, 300, 500,000 pounds per square inch of pressure, and you shut off the valve, things were flowing fine, that nothing burst when it had an outlet. But you shut off the outlet, and it builds up pressure like a pressure cooker, and so things start bursting. It's like a submarine sinking down in the water. The rivets start creaking and bursting. Water starts bursting in and out at different points. You either have to decrease the pressure, or you have to let the water in, or you have to let it in and pump it out, powerfully, or you drown. It's that simple. And so as we descend into the materialistic bureaucracy of culturally sanctioned dogma and materialism, we find new outlets where the psychic pressure, the healing pressure of imagination, of the feminine, finds its way in. And since that which is considered fact, and particularly in the most sanctioned places, we have our little hallowed halls of sanctimoniousness, whether it's the New York Times or Fox News or whatever the little box is, or Nature in Science, whatever the little box, those are the gateways for the politically correct mode of speaking, and every political correct dogma points to usually its anomalous heroes, the people that represent the ideal of political correctness. Well, in those patterns of media and research, you can look at what is, but far more importantly, what's not being said. What is, and far more importantly, is not being researched. What is, and far more importantly, what is not being felt. What is and is not being done. And so we look to the cult framework of political correctness, our best-selling books and this, that, the other, in order to see the asymmetry of the cult. Now, one looks to fiction to explore the imbalance that wants to come in. And so, for example, while in the political arena we're becoming more and more polarized, we're becoming more and more dogmatic, we're becoming more and more simplistic, we're becoming more and more this is the way it is, and very narrow in what is and is not acceptable. We have our politically correct, boxes. At the same time, what we see in media, meaning the new unconscious, the materialized version of materialistic realized unconsciousness, obviously it's late, because when you're making a $200 million version of Batman, it takes a couple of years, and it takes $200 million, and then it gets dumbed down a little bit in its own political process. But where you find the truth that's wanting to come in, and that might in another culture have come in dreams, where you find that in our culture is in Harry Potter. You have it in the X-Men. You have it in the OA. You have it in Sense8. A number of Netflix series. You have it coming in the realm that the cult doesn't pay attention to. Because in the area that the cult pays attention to, in politics and in facts, in defining the official version of reality, it can't come in because it's being kept out through the dogma of the cult. And so you turn your attention to that which is denigrated through the snobbery and chauvinism of the cult to say that's just imagination. Well, what that means is you're off the hook. No one is going to spend $100 million to start a campaign to say that Harry Potter is this and that and the other and should be this. I mean, there's voices about that, and that's to this and that's to that, and children shouldn't be reading that and this. But it's very minimal because it's considered fiction, and so who cares? In a materialistic cult, anything that's fiction is by definition irrelevant. So it's like, why argue about the political correctness of that which through our chauvinistic lens is irrelevant? So the argument doesn't take place and the argument doesn't get funded. And so the truth of the unconscious, the asymmetrical, anomalous information that doesn't fit into our asymmetrical box, leaks into the consciousness in that which is just imagination. And the most interesting thing, of course, is that if you want to make money in fiction, you have to touch people's feelings. If they don't feel satisfied as they leave the movie, you don't get a good rating. If the critic doesn't feel satisfied leaving the movie, it doesn't get a good rating. If you spend hundreds of millions of dollars and don't get a good rating, and nobody goes and sees the movie, in a capitalist framework, nobody makes that kind of movie again. And so what is the movie that gets made? It is the movie that touches on the cult's taboos. So in an uptight, sexually controlled culture, the more the outer cult becomes controlling and politically correct around sex, the more you have an explosion of pornography and gratuitous sensuality and violence, etc., in fiction media. And if you won't let people remember their dreams and talk about their dreams, but it's perfectly fine for the teenage population to discuss the latest movies endlessly and soap operas endlessly in school, then the unconscious comes out that way. And if it doesn't touch people's feelings in a meaningful way, in other words, if it doesn't help them grapple with a part of the psyche that is not being satisfied and dealt with in the culturally sanctioned dogma of the cult, then it isn't talked about. So you have a very interesting paradox where the most valuable media to consume is in the terrain where the cult considers it completely irrelevant. In other words, the cult's judgment and chauvinistic designation of irrelevance allows the unfettered, unedited truth of the suppressed psyche to come through. So if we look at the poetry of today, if we look at the most popular cartoons. In cartoons, you have an even freer sense. In animation and cartoon, you can portray feelings that are politically incorrect to portray among human beings. And so amongst cartoons, amongst animation, amongst fiction, action, adventure, amongst sci-fi, we now have the multidimensionality of the unconscious coming together. And the materialistic cultures that deny that in the inner world are spending billions to experience that. And rather than having several hours a night of lucid dreams and discussing the dreams and exploring that, which is just as fantastical, we spend billions of dollars and sit in our chair and with our giant TVs in order to consume the same information, because if we're not feeling it, we change the channel. And we change the channel until something comes in from the unconscious that speaks to something that we don't know how to deal with culturally and in our conscious mind. And so we just spend hours a day consuming the unconscious in that format. But unfortunately, we dismiss it from serious diagnosis, from serious message, when it is some of the most truthful information because it is unedited. And so we can also see the way that these fractal patterns that need to come in, these healing messages that need to come in, the same patterns go on in our country, which sends us messages about what's going on in the government of our own mind. And so as a good American with a highly cultivated inner critic in the political landscape, we have egos with a highly developed self-critical element inside, and we have the same amount of waste. We have the same amount of corruption. We have the same amount of power seeking. We have the same amount of lying. We have the same amount of backroom maneuvering and hiding things from consciousness and all kinds of control mechanisms within the ego structure of our own conscious mind as we do on the world stage. And so we can look at the government around us and conclude that within the framework of our own conscious mind and our own doctored version of hypocritical reality, we've got a relatively, in terms of percentage, large amount of waste, large amount of corruption, large degree of irrational rules that we're abiding by as conscious minds, raised by an irrational cult, and participating in the creation of an irrational cult. And the medicine of science fiction, of cartoons, of fantasy, of poetry and dreams, particularly if we will create our own, can guide us in that domain. Now, one of the things that I look at in media is for these fractal patterns. So I look at what's happening to Edward Snowden, I look what's happening to Julian Assange, and I look what's happening in my own spiritual community when a whistleblower speaks out and says, hey, that doesn't make any sense. That's violating the constitution of this community. And rather than reassessing the leadership and the power structure of the community, the whistleblower is cast out and the information is suppressed. And you say, aha, the same program that fractally runs this community, runs this family, and runs my own ego is running the culture at large. And so I can say thank you to my government for telling me about the corruption inside my own ego. And I can say, yes, we need a government at this stage in evolution, and 80% of its energy is making things worse or at its best, just protecting us from the terror of the unknown and chaos, but providing a structure that does as much damage as good. But until we can master our fear of trauma and chaos, we need some degree of structure, even if it's doing damage. Just like we need some degree of rationality and language to navigate within our own ego, even though whatever we're doing today is 100% guaranteed to seem incredibly backward 1,000 years from now. If we look back 500 years and look how medicine and education and gender relationships and religion and stone relationships and architecture and slavery, if whatever we look at 500 years ago, it is incredibly backwards. Well, the same could have been said, 500 years ago with people 1,000 years ago. 1,000 years ago, things were barbaric. Roman Colosseums, endless wars, slavery. And 1,000 years from now, every single thing that we're doing today will be trite, will be absurd, will be unscientific, will be absolutely insane, relative, not to 1,000 years ago, but relative to where we have grown to as a consciousness. And so if we understand that every single thing we're doing today is wrong, and that what's really being regulated in the cult is the pace of evolution, the pace of conscious evolution, and that we have a whole group of people that are afraid of the unknown because they're afraid of themselves. They're afraid of God. God is all that is. They're afraid of themselves. It's the same thing. And so they don't want change, because change takes them into the unknown. And so you persecute anything that leads to the disruption of the status quo. And at a certain point of chaos and rapid change, the ego can't keep up and collapses. And when you have a collapsed structure with egos that are terrified and overwhelmed and a level of chaos that the ego can't deal with, you can't evolve. On the other hand, when you're evolving so slowly that every hero, every voice of truth, beauty, and goodness that presents a truer rendition of the sphere is persecuted to protect ourselves from our own fear, we become a degenerate cult, which, like the 9,999 cults that anthropologists assess we have had in human history, dies, so that a new version that is not quite as afraid. You see, when a cult dies altogether, then what is formed can come out of the new. A cult needs to die if it won't change. So the question is, will you change or will you die? Will you die because of your terror of change as you come head to head with more and more reality, more and more of the anomalous details at the edge of reality that don't fit into your narrow box? Reality has never and will never fit into the narrow box capable of being conceived by a conscious ego. By definition, the conscious mind with its zoom-in lens at a given moment in space-time within a given set of paradigms, etc., sees less than a percentage of all there is to see. Which means that by the very nature of having a conscious mind, there will always be anomalous data that threatens the paradigm, that threatens the status quo, that threatens the way things are done, that threatens the current power structure, that threatens the current value hierarchy. will present itself as the Christ, as the mystic, as the uninvited guest at Rumi's table. And the question a cult has to ask itself is, will we invite that stranger to sit down and teach us? Or will we slay the stranger and with it our own future? Not the future in the totality of consciousness, but the future of the cult that is too rigid to change, be it the cult of our own ego, the cult of our own family, the cult of our own community, the cult of our country, of our culture, of our species. In the endless abundance of consciousness, in the endless expressions of reality, every death of every planet, every death of every species, every death of every culture, every family, every individual has been followed by new life in a more sophisticated form. A form that moves towards mastery of the power to create and destroy. And when that mastery of the power to create and destroy the form, the planet, the structure, is matched by an investment in the mastery to love, to partner with, to co-create and invite the uninvited guest, we see transcendence and evolution. And when we develop technological innovation to a point where we can create and destroy while retaining a fundamental terror of ourselves and thus the unknown, and thus God got us all that is, we will go to war with the other. And the thing about going to war with the other is that it is a larger part of ourselves than we are. Because by definition, the other is 99.99999% bigger than we are. We are the tiniest part of an ecological framework of which we are a part. When Hitler goes to war with the world, failure is preferable and inevitable. It's the same as if this planet goes to war with the universe. When a cult goes to war with the unknown, with anomalous data that challenges the cult, it will lose. And to the degree that it hangs on, defending its status quo and consuming vast amounts of resources to do so, it will destroy itself as it should, having proved that it lacked the sophistication and intelligence to partner and integrate with a larger part of itself, with the ecological framework of which it is a part. This is the challenge in human consciousness. Now, how I relate to media is to look at fractal patterns. So if I read a business book, I'm looking at patterns and paradigms. If I'm reading a mythological book, I'm looking at patterns and paradigms. I'm listening to Joseph Campbell, patterns and paradigms. If I'm listening to Babylon 5, patterns and paradigms. Star Trek, patterns and paradigms. Pinocchio, patterns and paradigms. Thumbelina, patterns and paradigms. Sleeping Beauty. Now, the easiest places to see the truth are in the undoctrinated and thus undoctored, unpolitically edited versions of truth, which are in the domains of fantasy and fiction. So if you want to know what's really going on, read Harry Potter. Look at the forces and the underlying themes, etc., and break that down. Because you'll have a deeper sense of what's emerging in the psyche than you will watching the news. You can watch the news to see what's going on in the cult. You can read Harry Potter to find out what deeply touches the psyche. Lord of the Rings, again, deeply touching a number of faces in the psyche in very beautiful ways. Enjoy.